Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to move a bit away because I'm a bit afraid that you won't see me behind the podium. So I'm a doctoral student at the University of Freiburg. And I hope... No? Yes. Okay. So as I'll be presenting to you today, what I'll be presenting is the first phase of my research, of my doctoral research, so what I have so far. And how I'll be going through the presentation is first I'm going to give a contextualization of my research so that you understand where I'm parting from. I'll go next to the purpose and objectives of it, the analytical framework I'm using, the case study I'm looking at, the methodological approach I'm applying, the first research phase, so the first phase that I've just finished, and the lessons learned so far and next steps. So my research starts from the point of the fact that since 1980s more or less, there has been a process called devolution of land, where people in forests have earned, so to say, the legal recognition of their rights to use and manage their own forests. This has mainly happened in South and Central America, and mainly because of two movements. On the one side is the human rights movement, so trying to ensure the livelihoods of these populations. And on the other side is the climate change and biodiversity crisis, so trying to use these populations as an opportunity to conserve primary forests. This, in the end, has brought a relatively new approach of forest conservation based on the sustainable forest management and use of these resources by communities, which has been applied through different schemes. However, all of these different schemes, what they have in common is that they are designed by non-locals, so by external organizations mainly. They follow neoclassical economic logic, meaning that the more production, the more incomes, the better. And they are enforced by governments. So what this leads is to local communities having very little chance to manage their resources based on their own capacities and interests. And in the end, there's a few success stories and a huge lack of implementation in the long term of these schemes. Why is this failure, so to say, of these schemes? Well, mainly because of three reasons. The first one being the fact that they're unsatisfactory in their financial attractiveness, mainly compared to other land uses such as agriculture, let's say. So there's a generation of insufficient incomes, also very attached to the fact that they need high investments for this forest production to become commercially viable, and there is high production and transaction costs. The second reason would be standardized approaches that neglect the specific conditions of these communities. So sometimes incomes are not necessarily the most relevant incentive for people to go into forest uses or forest production. And furthermore, there is an ignorance of the local capacities, their social structures, and their dynamics in general. Finally, the third reason would be insufficient support, which is not only little in the amount and in the time that projects are there in working with communities, but also it's not homogeneous. So these communities have hierarchies inside, and they have elites and so on, and this support often only reaches these elites. So what is my purpose? The purpose of my research is to contribute to fairer possibilities for these communities to actually use and protect their forests at the same time. And the main objective is to assess to what degree and under which conditions can relevant forest use schemes that are kind of like fostered by organizations and governments be an option for sustaining livelihoods at a local level for forest communities while also contributing to conservation, The analytical framework, or more or less how I understand this reality, which is really funny because I think yesterday we were discussing about what really is and how we researchers see it and what we actually portray. So this is how I portray it, which is not necessarily how it is, right? But in my reality, there are forest management and use schemes that vary differently between different characteristics, mainly the mechanization level, their production scale, so if this production can reach local, regional, or national and international markets, their operational complexity, so how complex is the whole process of production from the very, very beginning to the end product, and organizational schemes, so if they're organized commonly or if they are more like individual schemes. Their product range, so how many products or what type of products they're producing, and their social considerations. With these, I mean if the schemes themselves are taking into account some social good or social well-being for the community. These management schemes are then implemented by communities that are immersed in a certain context, depending on their quantity and quality of resources and how they can actually have access to them, in which tenure regime, their physical accessibility, how easily reachable they are to markets and services, their support intensity, their poverty level, and the livelihood strategies that they follow. Also, very important is the origin of the community, so how the community actually came to be a community, and how this is also linked to traditional forest uses and other uses of land. In the end, these two spheres are relatively shaped by the regional context itself of regulations, investments, and markets. So this kind of leads to communities having the range of possibilities that they can actually do with the forests, right? These three spheres, in the end, bring in the results for the potential for forests to contribute to livelihoods or to sustaining the livelihoods of forest populations, depending on the financial results of them. I want to try something. Yeah. The financial results of these schemes, based mainly on the total cost-benefit relationship, the incomes they generate, the investments they need and that they require and that they have available. The social acceptance, so meaning how these schemes are coherent with the reality of these communities and the preferences that they have on using their land. And finally, how environmentally compatible they are. So if the resource base of this community can actually in the long term hold these type of schemes. The case study that I'm working on is the Mayan Forest. So I chose the Mayan Forest because it's divided between three different countries, Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala, that although they have very different social and economical and political realities, they still have historical and cultural dynamics that are very shared, right? It's also the largest tropical forest in Central America, and it has large protected areas. So around 60% of the area of these countries is protected areas. Most of them are inhabited, and local uses are there of the forests. They're allowed. And it's also representative for other forest regions in Central America. So the cases I'm looking at is in Mexico, the Siancan Biosphere Reserve with two communities, Xacil and Felipe Carrillo Puerto. Felipe Carrillo Puerto being like the biggest one of my communities. Then in Belize, I'm looking at the Vaca Forest Reserve, which is a relatively small reserve holding up to around 80 farmers, 40 of which are living inside the reserve. And then in Guatemala, the huge Mayan Biosphere Reserve holding up around 190 communities, where I'm looking at two cases, Cruz de la Colorada and Huaxactún. There. The methodological approach that I'm using is divided in three steps. So the first step, which is the one that I'll be presenting to you right now, is the mapping of schemes and context. So what I did was I checked the literature, so around 200 articles on focusing on community forest management in Central and South America. And I did a classification of the common management and use schemes that they talk about, and also did the same for the community types, kind of. So the objective was a generation of scenarios. The second step, which is the one that I'm starting right now, is the confrontation of schemes and context. So with these 5 communities that I presented to you right now, what I'm doing is getting information from expert interviews and revision of government and NGO reports, open interviews and surveys, and trying to model these types of schemes into these community realities to evaluate the forest use and management schemes itself. And the third step would be the assessment of contribution of livelihoods of forests. So what I'm trying to do there is compare, okay, what level of incomes do this community need to maintain their level of well-being, and what would they require to enhance it to a relatively acceptable, so to say, international level of standard well-being, and which type of contribution can forests actually bring into these processes. So this first step that I worked on last year, I found 5 different community contexts mainly. It's important here to notice that the delimitation of this, or the classification of this context, is a bit blurry, right? Like, you can't really put a community completely on one type or one classification, so take that in mind. The first group would be the communities, indigenous groups in pristine forests. Here I want to make clarify something as well, because I use the word pristine as kind of a criticism to the literature itself, because pristine is really hard to find, right? Like, most of the forests right now have been affected or managed in one or another way. So, but that's what they're talking about, so in the end that's going to be probably in my discussion section. These communities are traditional forest users. They also have subsistence farming. They have a collective culture and a strong social organization most of the times. They have difficult access to markets and services because they're often very remote, but this remoteness brings them to have large areas of these pristine forests under collective tenure. The second and third type, migrants in degraded forests and government-led colonists in degraded forests, they're very similar. The only difference is that these government-led colonists have been supported by government projects to colonize the forest regions, right? So they have had some accompany there from the government and NGOs. These 2 communities are communities that have been coming into forests the last 50 years, more or less. They're both traditional farmers, so they're looking for land, mainly making forests more of an obstacle than something that they want to use. However, these government-led colonies, they have emerging forest uses because of this NGO and government support, and they also have off-farm incomes. They both have an individual culture. However, again, these government-led colonists, because of this companies, so to say, of government and non-government organizations, they have a bit of better social organization, seems like, and their access is also a bit better, right? So these are often people that are illegally there in forests, and they're hiding, and therefore also not very supported by governments and so on, so their access is difficult. And they both have different sizes of degraded forests, but in the end degraded. These ones manage it under individual tenure, and these ones are more into collective tenure. The fourth type would be historical communities in healthy forests. These are sometimes very comparable to the indigenous groups that I talked about first. They're also subsistence farmers, however, because they have been in the forests for at least 100 years or so, they do have knowledge of commercial uses of forests and other off-farm incomes. They have a collective culture and strong social organization as well. However, they have easy access because they have been in the place for long, and because sometimes there are mixed communities that have been able to fight for the land and so on, they have an easier access. And they have large areas of slightly degraded forests under collective tenure. And finally, we have communities in semi-urban forest contexts. So these are communities that are very detached from forests already, and their livelihood strategies are mainly based on off-farm incomes. They have individual lifestyle, but they can be well organized in associations. They're very easy to reach, and they have access to small areas of logged forest under collective user rights. Oh! Then on the side of the management schemes that I found 4 main management schemes. The first one being the subsistence. I don't know how to use this, I guess. Here. The subsistence one, that as its name states, it's a very low product, so to say, scheme, where the mechanization level is almost none. The complexity of operational complexity is very low. The organizational scheme, they work individually. They self-consume everything that they extract from forests, and they extract it unprocessed, right? So timber and non-timber forest products both, and they don't have really a social motive. The basic one would be low, and there is this term in literature called motor manual, which means that people are working with some machinery, but it's mainly manually used, right? So they They could potentially process some timber, but they're doing it also with chainsaws. They don't have any more options there. They have a low operational complexity, they're working collectively, and they only reach local markets, so their production is like small. The next one would be the advanced one, where production is a bit higher, right, reaching regional and national markets. It also has like a higher complexity, my goodness. Yeah, it has a higher complexity here under collective tenure, and it's mainly non-timber forest products that are both processed and unprocessed, and timber products that are processed, right? The last one would be the industrial one, where it's, as the word, as you can expect it, it's industrial, it's highly mechanized, it reaches national and international markets, it's individually organized through companies, and it's mainly based on timber. So the last part would be the lessons learned so far. This is important, this is relevant because the standardization of approaches to sustainable forest management in communities, looking at the different types of communities already, could bring into the failure of this. So this goes very much into the introduction of my presentation. Why? Because communities have different historical, cultural, political, and economic backgrounds, because forests have different capacities, right, like productive capacities. And also because this term forest communities doesn't necessarily mean that they are communities related to forests. They might just be living in a forested area, which doesn't necessarily mean that they really want to be stewards of forests or something like that. Most of them are just searching for agricultural land, right? So like I said, forest is more an obstacle than what they really want to deal with. So we also have to learn how to deal with these type of populations instead of just like this romantic idea of, like I said, pristine forests and indigenous communities working all together, which is a bit hard to find. And yeah, the next steps that I'm taking right now is my second fieldwork phase, which is mainly why I'm here. And I'm doing a survey for land use preferences around these 5 communities that I presented. I'm gathering market and financial information from this as well. And I'm doing a revision of forest inventories. So that will be it. Thank you very much.